My special guest tonight made his name on Monty Python. That alone will guarantee him a place in the history of modern comedy. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He created Basil Fawlty and Fawlty Towers. It was voted the most popular television programme of all time in a poll organised by the British Film Institute. He's a filmmaker, best-selling author of self-help books, and a successful businessman. His latest venture is a new 4-part series on the human face, which started this week on BBC One. Now, before we meet him, let's be reminded of his wonderful talent to make people laugh.
I would like you, if you would, to look closely at this picture. Hell is a purely voluntary organisation. 10 shillings will maintain a wreck for 2 weeks.
It's a stiff, bereft of life, it rests in peace. If you hadn't nailed it to the perch, you would be pushing out the daisies.
I look down on him because I am upper class.
You pompous, stuck-up twerp! Apologize! You're a naughty boy!
I'm really sorry. I apologise unreservedly.
If you're going to grope a girl, have the gallantry to stay in the room with her while you're doing it.
Au revoir.
You speak French, too.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Cleese. How are you?
I'm old and tired, but happy.
Old and tired.
Well, very old. I mean, that first clip about hell, I have no recollection of that.
That was from the David Frost programme that you did all those years ago, yeah.
I've absolutely forgotten.
Yeah,
Isn't it
I
extraordinary?
was going to say to you, when you see those tips, you get as much enjoyment out of them as the audience obviously do.
Yeah, if they're funny and if I've forgotten them. But I mean, you had, for example, one of the things I can't watch now is the German episode because there's 3 terrible bits of business in it, and you had one of them in that.
Really?
When the moose drops on my head, if you watch it, I mean, I shouldn't be saying this, but if you watch it, you can see I'm waiting for it. And then in the same episode, when the fire extinguisher goes in my face, I'm waiting for that. And then there's another bit of business, same episode, where dear Manuel straightens up into a frying pan. It's terrible. And nobody's ever noticed.
But it's the best television programme of all time.
Oh, but yes, ever since the world began.
In the history of the universe.
On any planet.
And nothing will ever catch it.
No, exactly.
Well, I mean, you must...
That's been decided by
the British Film Institute.
3 votes to 1.
Won by a long, long way, and deservedly so too. Looking back at your career, it's very interesting because this wonderful subversive element runs right the way through all your humour. And yet you come from Western Superman. I mean, isn't another contradiction in terms? Here's the subversive in Western Superman.
Well, you have to be in Western Superman. At least you did when I was growing up. In fact, my favourite school report was history. He indulges in subversive activities at the back of the room. That was from Mr. Rittmarsh, who was a history teacher who could not pronounce his laws properly, and was unfortunately teaching the 17th century, so he had Roundheads and Loyalists, and Restoration. But he and I kind of liked each other, but I didn't listen much.
You didn't? You had no notion then, no idea that you would one day become an entertainer and a writer and that sort of thing?
No, it didn't happen in Western Superman. I mean, it wasn't an option.
I mean, what would be open to you then? What were the options?
Accountancy.
Accountancy?
Oh, yes, they were all going to be accountants. Right. And my dad said to me, you know, my boy, he said, he used to get a little bit grand when he was talking. He said, my boy, what you don't realize is if you go into the accountancy office now, by the time you're 21, you will have the initials ACA after your name, and the world will be your oyster. Which is why we used to do those poisonously rude sketches about accounting. I was kind of getting it out of my system.
Exactly. Was your father disappointed in you then, when the way you turned out?
No, I don't think so, but he never quite got it.
Didn't he?
No, I mean, I'm being quite serious. In '67, when I was doing 3 Frost programs a week with David Frost and doing, I'm sorry, I'll read that again on Sunday. I got a letter from him saying, have you ever thought about going into the personnel department of Marks and Spencer? I told this story a few years ago, and somebody from Marks and Spencer sent me an application form.
What about Mum? Because Mum, you've not talked an awful lot about Mum,
No.
because she was still alive, mainly when when she was being talked about,
That's
or
true.
you were being interviewed. And she died last year, wasn't it?
She died in
101.
October, 101. She died the day after her 101st
Did she
birthday.
indeed?
And she was extraordinary in a way. She had a wonderful black sense of humor. And my dad was witty and off the wall. I remember Dad, I mean, if Dad couldn't get a meal in a restaurant, he'd call the waiter over and he'd say, I'm awfully sorry, but I've got an operation to perform at 3 o'clock. And the food would be there in the house. And we were driving once down a little windy Somerset Lane, and some lunatic came round the corner much too fast. We both had to slam our brakes on. And the guy jumped out of the car and came over and started abusing my father. So, what are you doing like that? Driving round in this thing? My father sat. When he finished, my father said, you are a fine old English gentleman, no? The guy looked at him for about 30 seconds and says, matter of fact, I am, yes. So that was my dad's sense of humor. My mother's sense of humor was extraordinarily black. And when, for example, she was quite a depressed woman. She had a lot of depression in her life. And she would ring me up and start going through all the things that were, bad about her life. And, as you get older, there are a lot of things that aren't very nice. But it's frustrating because you want to make them feel better. And you can't sort of say, well, have a double scotch and shape up, It's kind of... So one day, when she was saying, that this was bad and her leg was worse and 2 of her friends had died, and I said, well, look, you reach the point when you've had enough, Mum, and I know a little man in Fulham, and he'll come down and kill you. I think I said it out of a kind of desperation, because there is this stunned silence from the other end, and then she starts howling with laughter. Laughs and laughs and laughs. So from then on, if she started to get depressed, I would say, shall I call the little man in Fulham? And one day I said, the little man in Fulham has died, so I'm going to have to find someone. And she just went on and on.
But it was a very protected and cosseted atmosphere you lived in too,
Oh,
wasn't it?
yes.
I mean, your parents had you late on in life. And,
Very much later. I was a mistake. I mean, they'd been married 13 and a half years by the time I came
That's right,
along.
and you were the only child as well.
Only child.
So you grew up with a lot of sort of love and attention, I assume. Did your mother ever lose that feeling that you're always a small child? And that...
No. Oh, no, I remember when my last term at Cambridge, and I was very nervous about the criminology exam, because I'd switched to criminology very late, and they give me this book, and they say, if you know this, you should get through. But I was still quite scared, and I went into the criminology exam. I knew I'd got the other 4 papers okay. And I sat down, and, I looked at the paper, and you just go, oh, great, I passed. I know these, and I wrote the answers out, and I went and telephoned her, and I said, Mum, I got the criminology paper. And I passed, and that means I've got my degree. And she said, you remember the greeny brown socks that you took back at the beginning? So that's, it was greeny brown socks.
Yes,
was the sort of way in which we related most of the time. I don't think she ever quite got what I was doing. Python was a total mystery to her.
Was it?
But she quite liked, I'm sorry, I'll read that again.
But of course, she did the radio advert for Life of Brian, didn't she?
Yes.
Do you remember that? Because I remember the last time I talked to you in the 70s, we talked about it. It was wonderful.
Oh, it was wonderful. That's right. I wrote these with everyone did one. Michael Palin had his dentist do.
That's right.
And I did one with Mother saying. And what did she say? She said, "This is John Cleese's mother, and I'm in a home in Weston-super-Mare, and my son's got a movie coming out called Life of Brian, and if it's not a success." He won't be able to afford to keep me in the home, and that'll kill me. And then she laughed at the end, which was lovely. So we kept the laugh on, and she won. You won't believe this. She won the Dada Award and came up to the Dorchester Hotel and went up
See
and
what they were for?
received it in front of 800 advertising people who gave a standing reception from Lord Snowdon.
Now, what about when all this growing up? What did sex play a part at all in your life? I mean, as a young teenager, I mean, were you?
You have to be joking. We're talking about Western Superman.
Well, that was the second line of my inquiry. But, I mean, was it available? I mean, did you know about it? I mean, I love the part of the interview when I get to this subject. It's there.
I was such a late starter, sex-wise, that I'm embarrassed by it. I will write down on a piece of paper how old I was. Anyway, it was in the Station Hotel, Auckland, New Zealand.
How old were you?
That I broke my duck. I will never be able to do this.
How old?
24.
I think your mum would be proud of you.
If she'd ever suspected.
The Station Hotel in Auckland, New Zealand.
Oh, dear, yes. What about... And some newspaper found out and went and took a photograph of this building, you know, and it was like the hotel.
Of the building?
Yeah, and it was like
was
the
there
hotel
a plaque on the wall?
Psycho. Yeah, that was very, very embarrassing. I've been trying to catch up ever since.
All right, so in spite of mum and dad and in spite of passing your examinations at university, in fact, you ended up in showbiz. I mean, while you were at university, you went to Footlights. Yeah. Again, what's strange again reading about you, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that when you got there, you were attracted to the notion of these people who are doing Footlights, but there
I wasn't.
You were not?
This is the weird thing. I mean, I went up to the Footlights stall my first term, where there's all the societies, where you're potholers, you know what I mean, and the gliders and the people who want to play cards, they all have a little stall. And I went up and I said, I'm sort of interested. And they said, oh, are you good? Do you sing? And I said, sing? I mean, I was in a Broadway musical and I had to mime. That's how good I'm actually. That's true. That's true. And then they said, well, it doesn't matter. Do you dance? He said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, and I went bright red. I started trying to make people laugh, and I just ran away. And I didn't go anywhere near the Footlights for 2 terms. And then my oldest friend, who knew someone in the Footlights, was invited to go along, and the two of us did something together. And then it kind of happened. And I liked the Footlights because they were the most interesting bunch of people I came across at Cambridge. Wide variety of all the subjects they were studying, variety of classes. But they were just fun people.
Yes. Let's move on to the start of it, because you did the Frost Report, and you know that. And then...
I was thinking of that today, because I have to say, because I know you, I thought, why am I not feeling any nerves? I thought, am I dead? You know, no, I'm not dead. Because I remember 35 years ago in this building, 1966, I started doing television with dear Ronnie and Ronnie. And David, and a great bunch, but I was so scared. We used to do live shows at 8:30 to 14 million people. Mm. And I remember how scared I used to get. I remember I used to go and have a pee about 6 times before the show. And I remember standing there once thinking, if I was going into the arena with a bull, I couldn't be any more frightened than I am. It was extraordinary, you know, the fear.
Yes.
And when I got my first sketch done, I was so happy that I got through it. I totally forgot I was in the next sketch, never turned up for it. It was life-time. Dear Bernard Thompson, excuse me.
And then Python, of course, and that was the start of it all, wasn't it? I mean,
yeah.
It was extraordinary, wasn't it, when you look back at it? I mean, had you any idea when you started out on that you were going to change comedy?
Oh, we knew we wanted to do something different. But I always remember, excuse me, saying to Michael, when we were in the changing rooms, I always call them changing rooms.
Michael Palin.
Yeah, Michael Palin. Mm. I remember saying to him, just before we recorded the first show, do you realize we could be the first people in history to do a whole comedy show to complete silence? And he said, I was thinking exactly the same thing. And then we went out and we heard Jonesy and Chapman doing the first sketch, and ever so slowly people started to giggle. And I sort of looked at Mark and we thought, well, maybe we're all right.
It became a monster, didn't it, in a sense? I mean, the spin-offs from it, the cult surrounding it, and to this very day as well it exists, doesn't it?
Yeah, I kind of understand it, because we all felt the same about The Goon Show. I mean, I used to listen to The Goon Show in the 50s as a 16-year-old, and I used to listen to the first program. Then 2 days later, I'd listen to the repeat with my head against the radio so that I could pick up the 4 jokes that the audience laughed and drowned out.
Yes.
So I understood the enthusiasm.
Yes.
And I think it's something to do with the fact we were saying to a lot of younger people, don't take it all so seriously. You know what I mean? It's all fairly crazy. And you know that when you're a teenager, and then you kind of forget it as you get into your 20s. Then as you get older, you remember, oh yes, the whole place is a madhouse,
yes.
you know.
Yes.
And then you sort of, and we often notice that the people who like Python best were either people who are sort of under 22 or 23, or people who were actually over 65 who thought it was hysterical again.
Let's have a look. Let's be reminded, actually, of the team at work there. And this is a clip, not from Python itself, but from the movie you made, the Life of Brian.
Oh, yes.
You like The Life of Brian, don't
That's
you?
my favourite, yeah.
Why is it your favourite?
I think it's the best, and also we were making jokes about kind of important subjects, you know?
Yes.
I mean, it's best when jokes are usually about something important.
Something that matters.
Something that matters, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's have a look at it to be reminded.
Very funny.
It's very funny.
The lines that get me now are the little ones I've forgotten, like when they first throw a stone at dear John Young, and he says, oh, we haven't started yet.
It's very funny and very silly, isn't it?
Oh, wonderfully silly. Makes people terribly cross, you know. And you know they were all protesting outside the New York cinema. Oh, and all the established churches, the Lutherans, the Catholics, 2 lots of the Jewish faiths, and some Calvinists, I think, were all condemned. And Eric Idle said, well, at least we brought them together for the first time.
Yes, you were banned in Berkshire and Dorset and all over the place, weren't you? It's interesting watching that and watching your reaction to it. I mean, great enjoyment there. But I know the things that you don't like being reminded of from that time. And for instance, one of the great standout sketches of all time was a minister for Silly Walks.
Oh, yeah.
And I know you can't bear it, can you?
Well, I never thought it was as funny as everyone else.
You didn't?
No, I really didn't. And when I did it for the television, I spent a lot of time, you know, in my little flat in Basil Street. Did you know I lived in Basil Street?
did not.
No, there's a giveaway, isn't it? And I was working out all the steps. And then we did it, and it went quite well. And then suddenly, everyone was raving on about it. I thought, well, it's a good piece of material. Well, it's not bad for Mike and Terry. Anyway, let's put it like that. And I quite was puzzled by it. But then when we were doing the stage show, which was, God knows when, I mean, 30 years ago, they wanted to put it in. And I said, oh, is that good? And when we did it in Southampton, the first night of the tour of the British Isles, it laid a total egg. And there I was doing all this stuff in my legs. I mean, how embarrassing does it get? I mean, there wasn't a snigger. And I came off into the wings and I said, right, that's out. I'm not doing that again. And they said, oh, give it one more. I said, no, it didn't work. Did it work? Well, no, but give it one more. So I did it the next night at Brighton. And it was a riot.
What about the Dead Parrot sketch? Another one that people can quote line word for word.
Well, it was funny. We had to do wouldn't have to, but they chose to ask us to do the Dead Parrot show again, sketch again in New York when Michael and I were doing publicity for Fierce Creatures on Saturday Night Live. So we went out to dinner a couple of nights before, and we were sitting in this steakhouse, and we couldn't remember the lines. And I said to Michael, well, should we just go out and stop someone on the pavement?
Because they will know.
Yes, because when we were doing it, I remember when we were doing it at Drury Lane, Michael's very naughty on stage, and unfortunately he always breaks me up, you see. So he said something silly. I think I said something like, he says, I don't have a replacement parrot, I've got a slug, you know. And I say, does it talk? And he's supposed to say, not much. And he said, it mutters a bit. And I started, and I broke up. By the time I got back, I got my laughter under control and straightened up and sort of turned back to the audience again. I'd totally forgotten where we were in the sketch. I had no idea, and I was very relaxed that night, and I said to the audience, what's the next line? See? And 40 of them shouted it out. And I thought, well, what is the point of this thing?
Yeah, it is extraordinary, as I said, the entire thing surrounding people quoting huge chunks of it. What was the dynamic of that team working together? Because I know that you have a particular fondness for Michael Palin, and you've said that.
Yeah, Michael and I have always got on. We're kind of sort of natural pals.
When you did Desert Island Discs, for your luxury, you chose Michael Palin to take to it, and Sue Lawley said stuffed, and you said if necessary.
If necessary. Well, it would save having a radio, because Michael does talk a lot. You know that.
What about the again, going back to the dynamic of it, what about the problem there must have been, too, of working with Graham Chapman? I mean, I like Graham, a nice man who didn't like Graham, except he was an alcoholic, of course.
Yes.
Did that affect the process?
Yes, because the first series, he wasn't a drinker, and it all happened very, very, very fast indeed. I can still remember we were shooting the first Python movie, and we couldn't find a script. And Graham wasn't in the caravan, and Michael said, oh, Graham's got a script. And opened up this little suitcase that Graham carried with him everywhere. I opened it up, and I saw Michael kind of go like that. And I said, what? And he was looking at this bottle of vodka, which was half empty, and he said, that was full this morning. And this was about 10:30. So that's when we knew Graham was in trouble. But we were awful cowards. We never confronted each other on anything.
Yes.
And, I mean, Michael has a wonderful story which he told at Graham's memorial service, which was a glorious event, full of people crying, and then Roy was laughing, then crying. It was just like those things should be. And he told this wonderful story about how he would go and pick Graham up every morning, take him from Hampstead into rehearsal. But Graham was always late. And you know he was gay.
Yes.
And had a grand stable of companions. So Michael would come and press the button, and nothing would happen for a bit, and then window would go up upstairs, and a nice-looking Chinese boy would look at him, and he'd go away, and then a nice-looking Nigerian boy would look at him, and then a nice-looking Indonesian boy would look at him. Finally, Graham would appear and say, oh, hello, Mikey, I'll be down in a moment. And then Michael would sit there and read the paper, and 25 minutes later, Graham would come down and get in the car. Never a word of apology. Michael would never say why, and drive off again. And at the memorial service, Michael said, and I like to feel that Graham, who died 4 weeks ago today, is actually with us here this afternoon. Or rather, he will be in about 30 minutes. It's one of the greatest jokes I ever heard. The roof came off. But he was a sweet guy, and he beat drinking eventually. He fell over and gashed his head on a fender just at the Christmas of '87, just before we made Life of Brian. Have I got my years wrong? 77, before he made Life of Brian. And he totally snapped out of it. It had a little help, and he was amazing. And what was so extraordinary was after that, he was fitter than we were. He was unbelievably fit, because he was a doctor, and he knew what to eat and what not to eat.
He once came to a BBC Christmas party here, light entertainment party, when Bill Cotton was in charge. And Bill was looking over my shoulder, and he froze, and I thought, what's happened? And I turned around, and Graham had come in, wearing high heels, a frock, carrying a handbag, and smoking his pipe. It was a marvellous moment. Bill Cotton was in total shock for about 5 days.
Graham would come to parties, cocktail parties like that, and would crawl around on all fours, nibbling people's ankles. And when he went to receive an award once on behalf of the team, I can't remember. I think it was the Sun newspaper gave us an award. And Graham went on, Reginald Maudley, who was Chancellor of Exchequer, was God knows what Reggie Maudley was doing, presenting awards. Anyway, Graham got quite near Reggie Maudley and then just started screaming. And just screamed and screamed and screamed. And Reggie Maudlin started backing away from it. And then he ran up and just grabbed it and ran off. And he went to speak at the Oxford Union on some very serious subject. He went dressed as a carrot. He just wore this carrot costume, which was totally orange and went all the way up to the top. And then there was this little sprig of green. And when it was his turn to speak, he got up and didn't say anything. He just stood there for 20 minutes.
That would be the best.
Not saying anything at all.
All right, when you were there with these people, I mean, was there a sense then that you wanted to branch out by yourself? Was that the reason that you wanted out? That you thought, no, I've got to go solo. It's better that way.
No, it was. I felt that we weren't moving on.
Right.
And when we got to the third series, I wasn't crazy about doing the third series because I felt we were already repeating ourselves. And when people wrote sketches, I would think to myself, well, that's this from the first series and a bit of that from the second and then a bit from that from the second. Yeah. And in the whole of the third series, I think Gray and I only wrote 2 things, which were the Highwayman and the Cheese Shop, which were actually original, and everything else was derivative. Yeah. And there was a bit of me, almost a purist bit, that felt, what's the point of doing this comedy if you're now repeating yourself? Yes. And I kept saying it to the others. And in my own defense, I say they didn't really hear me. I don't think they wanted to hear me, and they thought I was not meaning it or I was striking some attitude. So when I eventually said to them I didn't want to do it, they were kind of really quite surprised.
Yes, and then, of course, you discovered Basil.
Basil Fawlty, yes. I had a lunch with Jimmy Gilbert, and he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd like to write something with Connie. And he said, fine, write a pilot.
And this man had been lurking in the back of your mind.
Yeah, but I didn't know it, because I sat down with Connie and we said, well, what are we going to do? We can't do that sort of clever man-woman stuff that Mike Nichols and Elaine May used to do, because John Bird and John Fortune, Eleanor Bron had done it. So what should we do? We looked at each other and said, well, the hotel we stayed at in Torquay. And we said, yeah, okay. So we just started. We knew it was that.
The man you immortalised there was a real... Did he ever live to see what you did?
Yes, he did, because I'm afraid the Daily Mail, I once mentioned his name, and they tracked the poor so-and-so down in Miami, and they showed him and his family the program, and the daughter said, yes, that's Dad.
Did you have to alter him much from the original? From
yes,
the original
I had to make him much taller.
That's all. I mean, it was all there. Basil was there.
Oh, it was there. He was the rudest man I've ever come across in my life, and it was as though, you know, this hotel would run really well if we weren't constantly bothered by these guests. And if we could get rid of the guests, the whole hotel business would be... You know. And I don't know, there were so many stories, but I just remember that we were having dinner early on, because all the Pythons were staying there, and then they decided to leave because they couldn't put up with it. And for some reason, I stayed on, and Connie came and joined me, which is how we actually kind of observed the man. But at dinner, Terry Gilliam, being of the American persuasion, was doing what Americans do. He cuts up meat like that, and then they put the knife there, take the fork in the right hand, and they spear the meat. And Mr. Sinclair was walking by, trying to avoid people's eye and look lofty, and he said, we don't eat like that in this country. And it was so astounding. You know, and then everything was too much trouble, you know? I came down the stairs, and he was one of those people who'd stare into space. The moment he saw a guest coming, he'd busy himself. So you'd come up to the desk and just stand there for a bit, and eventually you'd say, excuse me, he'd say, oh, what? Could you call me a taxi? He said, call you a taxi? Well, you know, call me a taxi. All right.
Let's be reminded of the awful Basil in this wonderful sequence from one of the shows you did called The Psychiatrist. But this is one of my favourite sequences. That's faultless. There wasn't anything wrong with that, was there?
No, that was good.
That was good.
Wonderful. But I had the energy of that.
It had the lot. I mean, it's a very funny script to start with, and
it was
wonderful
a good script,
situation.
But the team was so good.
Oh yes,
know?
it was flawless.
Well,
all the ensemble playing.
Yeah, and they were wonderful. I mean, Ballard Barkley, who was not with us anymore, was a wonderful, wonderful actor.
Yes, it's perfect, and it stands the test of time. You see,
I think it does at the moment, but they all date eventually. They all date.
Do you think so?
Oh yeah, I do.
What about the plot lines for Fawlty Towers? I mean, the Kipper and the corpse and that sort of thing. Where do you get that kind of inspiration from?
Well, we used to ask people, and I had a friend called Andrew Lehman who'd worked in the restaurant business, and I knew he'd worked at the Savoy. And I said, Andrew, what was the worst problem you had at the Savoy? And he said, getting rid of the stiffs. And of course, and your heart leaps with joy because he's just given you a 30-minute episode with one comment. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, the trouble was, you know, trying to get them into the service lift before any of the guests. It's all absolutely true. And I'm afraid what he told me was a lot of elderly folks who didn't have any relations left would go into the Savoy Hotel. and take a few pills and not wake up in the morning because they knew that the Savoy would handle it beautifully. That's rather touching.
No, I mean, after you did Fawlty Towers, I suppose you looked around for a different branch of a different change of direction.
Well, I thought I can't spend the next 25 years entirely doing interviews about it, so I thought I'd better find
something else to do. So you made a blockbuster movie. I mean,
eventually, but a long time, 7 years later or something. Yeah.
Fish Called Wanda.
Fish Called Wanda.
Yeah, I mean, and that, of course, that again, in that you perfected this repressed Englishman, didn't you? This guy who comes up against the American culture, if you like, which is so very different. It's something that's interested you, isn't it, for a long time?
Fascinated me. And I don't
what is it particularly that fascinates
Well, I tell you what it was. It was a very strange thing, and I've been, you know, I believe in all this, you know, early experience stuff, or at least I believe it to some extent. I think it can be wildly exaggerated. But I had an odd experience. When I was at Clifton, I was in the cricket team, and we were playing at Lord's right at the end of the year. When we were all saying goodbye in the dressing room at the end of the match, there was an American there, I still remember his name, Jim Wickenden. And I'd liked Jim, and I always got on well with him. And I said, well, I said, Jim, we may not ever see each other again. And he just gave me a hug. It's funny, I feel touched by it. And at that moment, I thought, this is a better way. This is a better way than all that English distance and inhibition.
Is that because, I mean, was there no physical contact in your family?
Oh no, with my father a little. My father a little.
A little, but
my mother didn't want me to kiss her because it spread germs. That was...
Really?
Yeah. And, you know, at Clifton, if you put your arm around someone, it was obviously you were homosexual. You were taken off to be flogged.
Yes.
So there was... and, you know, the thing about homosexuality, it was worse than anything. You know, you could burn down a building with 30 people in it. It was kind of high spirits. But, you know, homosexuality, I mean, forget it. I mean, this is the end of the world. This is the ninth circle of hell.
This is all accounts to that line in Fish Called Wanda about we're embarrassed all the time, that's why we're dead.
That's right.
That's what you say, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if I say this in the film, but I've often said that a nice middle-class person, their main ambition in life is to get safely into their grave without ever having been embarrassed. You know, and if you get through life and you've never been embarrassed, you kind of think, whew, I made it.
Somehow, I've accomplished something.
That's right, I've really accomplished something.
All right, let's be reminded now of Fish Called Wanda, which you talked about there. This film made a lot of money. I mean, it made a fortune. It was hugely successful. And
those were the days.
And, well, and you did a nude scene in it.
Yes. Well, the easiest way to get people into the cinema.
That's what we thought.
That's
what I thought it was.
Yeah,
it was a cynical ploy.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's have a look at the cynical ploy then. Here we are in Fish Called Wanda.
I tak, lekko.
Archie,
Yeah?
Are you rich?
No, I'm afraid not.
What about the house?
Well, that's Wendy. She's the rich one.
Oh.
Jest silu благодатня созвущий слав живу, и душит непонятня святая прелистоване. И души, как бремя скатит, сомнение далеко, и верится, и плачется, и так легко.
what the hell are you doing?
I might ask you the same question.
Who are you? What? Get your clothes on.
Will you leave immediately, please?
What?
You're in the wrong flat. This flat belongs to Patrick Balfour. He's in Hong Kong, and he lent me the key. Now get out.
We leased it from the agents last weekend.
Yes, well, obviously that changes things a bit.
Aren't you Archie Leach? You bought our house in Lissenden Gardens. Hazel and Ian Johnson.
What a coincidence. How nice to see you.
It's funny sometimes tracing where that came from, but my oldest friend told me a story that I based that on. He'd known a family who had a flat in London, and they very seldom used it. They lived down in Surrey or somewhere, and they gave him a key, and they said, Alan, any time you want to use the flat, you know, do. And he said, well, that's really nice. And 6 months later, he was going to some black tie thing on Park Lane, and he thought, I'll use their flat. So he went in, and he got an evening dress, and then went to the event, and he came back afterwards, poured himself a drink, having a bath, and he heard somebody come in, and he shouted, it's only me. And then there was a pause, and somebody said, who is it? And he said, it's Alan. And they said, Alan who? He said, Alan Hutchison. And there was this pause, and it turned out that the people who'd given him the key had sold the flat. So much of the funny stuff is based on humiliation.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah.
So that's right. It is. Yes, it's the old banana skin joke, isn't it? I mean, that's
right.
the humiliation of the guy walking down
Yeah.
with a suit on, and up he goes in the air, and all dignity has gone.
And when
Exactly
Connie
that.
and I were writing 40 Tales, we'd think what we'd do to Basil next, and then we would laugh, and then we would ache for him. You know, we think, oh, poor man.
I mean, has comedy, have you found it fulfilling in the sense as you go through life? I mean, have you found it a proper job in a sense?
Oh, yes,
One
I think
that's-
so. And the wonderful moment is on stage when people are laughing, because the trouble about television, you make a television show, and you kind of think, it goes out, you go, and then nothing. Friend calls, and you say, did you see the Python last? Oh, no, I forgot, you know?
Yes.
And then about 4 days later, someone in the cab says, oh, yeah, I saw it. Yeah, it was all right last week. Yeah, I thought it was quite good.
Yes.
And there's this strange, you sending messages out to the universe and little's coming back. The wonderful thing, obviously, about doing something live is when you see them laugh, it's a tremendous feeling.
But I ask you the question because, you know, several people have observed, and you must be aware of it, that since you got involved in all the sort of psychiatry, Robin Skinner, and indeed your third wife, and the books that you wrote, the best-selling books about self-help books, but that somehow you've seemed to try to deny that comedy, that you become, in a sense, when you are that person, boring rather than
It's
being
just
the funny man.
my best quality is my curiousness. I've always been very curious about the world, and the fact is that when you're doing comedy, you don't learn anything.
How do you mean?
Well, you don't learn anything. You just do it. It's a skill. I think it's like dear old Steve Davis. You know, you're a wonderful snooker player, and every day you go out and, you know, you do your art, you do your skill. But at the end of it, what have you learned that's new that you didn't know that morning?
Yes.
If I learn something new, I actually go to bed happy. That's kind of my criteria for days if I've learned something I didn't know or understood something I didn't know. And the trouble with comedy, I mean, with the Pythons, I felt it was a sausage machine.
Yes,
We do one
yes, I
show, and next
understand.
week we do another show, next week, and so there wasn't enough variety to it.
Yes. Therefore, would this latest project that you're doing, The Human Face, that would satisfy your curiosity, wouldn't
Oh,
it?
yes. I mean, that's been the research side of that was fascinating. The great thing is I met the world expert on lying, who's becoming a friend. The guy knows more about beauty and the sort of scientific measurement of beauty, which sounds astounding, but he's actually shown that it all goes back to a proportion that the ancient Greeks knew about, Pythagoras knew about, and a Florentine mathematician called Leonardo, but not the Leonardo, we know as Fibonacci, worked out what it is numerically, 1 to 1.618. And the extraordinary thing is, for example, that if you are beautifully proportioned, then the distance from the top of your head to your navel is 1.618. If you multiply that by 1.618, it's the same as the distance from your navel to your feet, which is very weird. And that's the same for the proportions of the joints of the fingers. And it's also, for example, that distance, your mouth, 1.618 multiply that by, it's that width.
So
It's actually extraordinary.
You
It's in
can
flowers,
construct it, yes.
it's in the shells of snails. And I was telling this to an editor, and the editor said, well, don't you realize that it's the proportions of a frame of film? I said, what? He said, it's 1 to 1.618. So this proportion is out there, and this guy has constructed a kind of grid based on triangles and pentagons that are all 1.618. And you put that on a beautiful face, like Elizabeth Hurley would do it, and it fits it perfectly. And the face can be very, very different and from different cultures. And yet these proportions seem to be somehow built in.
In all cultures?
Yeah, in all cultures.
I see.
It's extraordinary. And this guy's become a friend, so that's exciting.
But what about Orwell's observation that by the age of 40, we all get the face we deserve?
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm afraid it's true.
It's true. Well, and the obvious question to follow up that, of course, is and therefore, can you tell personality from a face?
Yes, with older people, I think.
You can.
But what I learned from this series is that you really can't tell anything like as much about a person from their face as you think when they're young. For example, if you find a guy and you put up his face and it's a face with the eyes closed together, people will all agree that you can't trust him. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that people whose eyes are closed together are untrustworthy, yet we all agree they are. You see what I mean?
Yes,
it's a sort of mass delusion.
I do.
But as you get older, and this is how we finish the beauty program, we look at faces and we say, you know, if you're a miserable old sod, you're going to finish up looking like that. And yet if you got the laugh lines and then you can say, that's somebody who's getting their life right. I kind of like them. So I think from 40 on, you can begin to get real evidence about people.
And do beautiful people have a better time than me and you?
Well, I asked Candice Bergen. Yes.
It's a good question,
do at the
isn't it?
beginning. They do at the beginning, but I asked Candice Bergen, and she said her dad had told her when she was very young, he said, careful about being beautiful. Beautiful people kill themselves much more than people who aren't beautiful. And she said, well, thanks for the warning, Dad. Yeah. But there's a lot of downsides to beauty, and my wife's terribly good on this. She says that if you're very good looking, so much stuff comes to you without you ever having to work for it, that you don't learn to develop the other parts of your personality. And the danger then is, of course, when you start losing your looks, you really panic because there's nothing to fall back on.
Yes.
Whereas people, you know, who've developed other parts of themselves, getting old isn't such a
big
worry.
deal.
Yeah.
All right. Now the fourth program, the last in the series, we've had one so far this week.
That's Fame.
It's a very interesting program.
Yeah.
Because all the programs involve you, but you approach it from in one part of it, your own attitude toward fame.
Yes, that's
which
right.
is very interesting. And some of it we touched upon in our talk. But now let's look at this clip from it. Which it's a lovely clip. This it kind of sums up what we've been talking about. Let's have a look. This is the clip from Fame, the fourth in the series.
Seriously, what do you think of the black cherries?
They're nice. The black cherries are nice, yeah.
Okay, give me about half a pound.
Give me about half a pound?
Sure, about
half a pound.
All right.
Hold on, you haven't paid for those. Unfortunately, we know where you live, mate, so you can't get away.
Well, if you're as slow as that, you don't deserve to be paid.
Oh.
Out we go.
Do you want a bag?
No, the hands are working just right. You see, that's the kind of recognition I like, and I think everyone does, because it makes you feel part of the community. You know, to those guys, I'm just the man who's lived around the corner for years and who apparently is sometimes on the television, which is great, because it feels natural. And they know me a bit, so it's real. Whereas this business of getting recognized from the television.
Oi, Basil!
To be totally honest, I've never been 100% comfortable with it. It feels, well, a bit artificial. I mean, they don't know who I actually am.
You shot him!
Only a bit.
You've been wanting to do that for a long time,
Well, I've
haven't you?
been tempted. I've been tempted. Yes, that's the terrible thing, because I am sort of well-mannered, but there are times when people come up and start talking about their favourite Python sketch or something, and I just think, if I could just pick that blancmange up very gently and just...
But I mean, it's something you're not going to get rid of, is it?
Oh no, not in this country. But in America, it's quite different,
you treat
which
it
is slightly liberating, because for some reason, the Americans just see me as a guy who's done these various things, and Fawlty Towers is amongst them. But I'm not particularly identified with it. In fact, I'm probably more identified with Python, and oddly enough, even possibly with the books I wrote with Robin. So it's like they accept me, you know, for the various things I do, rather than just seeing me as one facet.
You made the point in that program that the problem with fame is you can't get rid of it. You can't give it away.
No, you can't switch it off.
You can't
and I think
switch it off.
That's the problem.
Why would you want to?
Because at the beginning it's terrific.
Yes.
You know, at the beginning you get recognised, you feel wonderful. Your little ego swells up and you feel all warm and happy. And then it goes on.
That's what happens when your little ego swells up. We're back in New Zealand now.
Yeah, once you're 24. Passing over there. And then you kind of begin to get used to it. And then there's a certain point when you begin to find that the negative, I mean, you know, it's not nice to wake up in the morning and have your secretary call you, be careful, the paparazzi sitting in the car outside with long lenses, you know? It's not nice. It really isn't nice at all. And people often think, oh, you could shrug that off. But I promise you, I don't know anyone who can. It's an uncomfortable feeling. And it also means that you get stared at a lot. And after time, the good side of that begins to fade away. And it just becomes something that interferes with, this is going to sound pompous, but interferes with living a sort of authentic life. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
Because to some extent we're always putting on some kind of face. I mean, you and I are more relaxed in front of camera, but we're always projecting some kind of face when we're in public. And that face can become kind of permanent, as I think it sometimes becomes with politicians, and to the point where you don't really believe there's anything much left behind the face.
Yes.
And I think it's terribly, terribly important. I mean, if I go out and do a publicity tour, I genuinely feel after 4 weeks that I'm a bit more fake than I usually am, because I'm kind of projecting an image and selling something and trying to manipulate the conversation in a positive direction. So what about the bit behind you that's more authentic? Well, if you don't get away and get rid of the public face and go back into the authentic bit now and again, I think you can lose it.
Yes.
I think public figures do.
And it leads, of course, to this exploitation, doesn't it, too? It's something you define in that programme as being celebrity pond life. I mean, the entire notion now of celebrity is quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean,
well, you don't have to do anything.
No.
I mean, one of the things we say in that programme is that somebody who was famous in let's say, 1850 was the Duke of Wellington, because he'd actually commanded the armies for a bit, or Florence Nightingale. I mean, those are the people who were famous, or Brunel had built a few bridges. But now, if you play third lead in a sitcom, you're famous. You know what I mean? And the trouble is, people, I think we do look for guidance from heroes. And the trouble now is that the heroes don't know anything. Now, if you could have sat down with the Duke of Wellington, you could have learned something really quite interesting from that guy, or Florence Nightingale. But you sit down with an actor from a sitcom, what do you expect to learn? And yet, because people are staring at them, we think that they have to know something that we don't know. And it isn't true.
Now, when you look back on that journey you made from Western Supermare, this fifth columnist from the middle class, this subversive performer from Western Supermare, I mean, is it true, the old saying, that you can take the boy out of Western, but you can't take Western out of the boy? Is it still true?
Oh, yes.
It is, today?
I'm just a little small-town guy who doesn't like having debts and doesn't like wasting food. And I think most of us are just waiting to be found out, you know? Particularly if we're artists, because you never know if you can do it tomorrow. There's a wonderful story about Monet. Monet, when he was 80, was going out to paint, and his hand used to shake every day. And somebody said, why is your hand shake in the morning and not later on? Wondering if it was to do with booze. And he said, well, I don't know if I can do it each morning. You know, if somebody like Claude Monet doesn't know if he can do it, none of us ever know if we can do it. So we don't really believe we're that good, because we know it can fall apart at any time. You know?
And are you going to grow old disgracefully?
Yes. Alice Faye and I decided when we get to 85, it's to hell with it. It's going to be drugs, orgies, you know, a lot of cream.
Yeah.
I mean, just...
Yeah. Perhaps you might go to New Zealand again. And celebrate.
The station hotel.
The station, I'm going to go there and make a pilgrimage. It was here, and he was 24. But, and finally, what of the future? What are you looking at? What's the next step? Are we going to make more movies? Or, I mean...
No, I love doing movies when they're short and sweet. I mean, because you work 12, 14-hour days now, and that's a grind. You do 3 weeks of that, and they want you to do a close-up at 8 o'clock. You're not doing work that you're very proud of, I find. But I'm just kind of always been curious about my best quality. I've always been curious about why we're here, and I actually think there may be some something, some reason we're here, and that's what really interests me now. So I'm just going to hang around and probably become very disillusioned. But then I have a little ranch with 50 animals on it: horses, birds, chinchillas, rats, alpacas, goats. And that's a pretty nice place to spend my time.
And they don't know you as Basil Fawlty, do they?
No. Although I'll tell you something, you won't believe this.
What's that?
You really won't believe this. I have a Mexican working for me. I promised you.
Yeah.
Manuel. It's true.
John Cleese, thank you very much indeed. John Cleese.
It's fun, isn't it? I never told anyone about Manuel.
Thank you.
I just couldn't believe it when I was introduced to him and I liked it and I said, what's so great?
My thanks to John Cleese. On next week's show, my guests are Hollywood superstar Kevin Costner and two men renowned for their ability to make us laugh, Lee Evans and Martin Clunes, plus music from the splendid Texas. That's next week. Join us then. Until then, from all of us here, a very good night. Good night.
We're off to the Big Brother house next here on BBC One, all in the name of comic relief.